2003, in a Hampshire village shop, sub-postmistress Jo Hamilton watched her computer invent a debt in front of her. The screen said £2,000 was missing from her post office till money she had never seen. She phoned the helpline and followed its instructions, and while she was on the line, the missing $2,000 became $4,000. She remortgaged her house to pay it. Her employer prosecuted her anyway for theft in front of her whole village. But the money never existed. The computer was lying. The people who owned it knew, and proving that would take 21 years and an act of parliament like no other. What happened in that village shop happened in some form to roughly 1,000 people, prosecuted on the word of one machine, most by their own employer, across 16 years, while warning after warning was put in writing and filed away. England, 1999. It begins with an upgrade. A sub-postmaster is not quite a shopkeeper and not quite a civil servant. In Britain, the post office counter usually lives inside somebody's shop. The newsagent, the grocer, and the person behind it is a private citizen who has bought the right to serve their village on behalf of a centuries-old national institution. They hand out pensions on Thursdays. They take in Christmas savings. They know which customer needs the forms read aloud to them. In thousands of villages, the sub-postmaster was the closest thing the community had to a bank, a notary, and a friend with an official stamp. The red sign over the door meant the same thing on every high street in the country. The state in walking distance, with a familiar face behind the counter. People queued at 9 for their pensions and stayed to talk. The sub-postmaster cashed their checks, weighed their parcels, kept their confidences. It was a good life, modest, respected, permanent. The people in this story did not drift into it. They bought their way in, with their savings and their houses, because running a village post office was the safest thing a careful family could do with its money. People paid for that privilege. In May 1998, a man named Alan Bates and his partner Suzanne Sercombe put £65,000 of their own money into a small post office in Creggy-Don on the North Wales coast. He was a careful man, the kind who kept receipts, filed paperwork, backed up his backups. That detail will matter more than anything else in this film. In 1999, the post office began rolling out a new computer system to every branch counter in the country. It was called Horizon, built by the British firm ICL under its Japanese owner Fujitsu, and it was described at the time as the biggest non-military IT contract in Europe. The terminals arrived the way the future usually does, as an instruction. The paper ledgers that sub-postmasters had balanced by hand were carried out, and from that day the branch's truth was whatever the screen said it was. Most branches got on with it. The machine was modern, the institution was centuries old, and nobody buys a village post office expecting to need a lawyer. By late 2001, Horizon was everywhere. And almost at once, in shop after shop, the same strange scene began to play out at closing time. A sub-postmistress cashes up. She counts the till twice. The cash in her hand and the number on the screen do not agree. The screen says money is missing. Not a rounding error, hundreds of pounds. Sometimes thousands appearing overnight, between locking the door and unlocking it. In Creggy-Don, Horizon arrived in October 2000. By December, Alan Bates was staring at an unexplained hole of around 6,000 pounds. He did what everyone did. He rang the helpline. The search that came first played out behind thousands of those counters. You count the till again. You count the safe. You go back through the week's receipts line by line, hunting for your own mistake, because it must be your mistake. The alternative is unthinkable. Husbands and wives sat up past midnight with shoeboxes of paper, checking each other's arithmetic against a machine that would not show its own. The screen did not argue. It simply repeated the number. The helpline had an answer, and the answer never changed. No one else is having this problem. You are the only one. The inquiry that finally examined this scandal heard that sentence described by sub-postmaster after sub-postmaster. The same reassurance, delivered up and down the country to hundreds of people at once, each of them alone in a dark shop with a number that could not be true. It was not a small lie. It was the load-bearing lie. If you are the only one, the machine is fine, and the problem is you. And here the trap closed because of a clause most of them had never dwelled on. Under their contracts, sub-postmasters were personally liable for losses shown in their accounts. The court that later tore this system apart put it simply: Horizon offered no way for a sub-postmaster to dispute Horizon's own figures. The screen said the money was gone, the contract said the shortfall was yours, and the institution treated an illusion as a debt. So they paid. From savings, from remortgages, from their parents, and some of them, exhausted, frightened, assured they were alone, pressed the button that said the accounts balanced when they did not, just to keep trading until someone sorted it out. British law has a name for pressing that button. It is called false accounting, and it carries a criminal record. Alan Bates refused to press it. He refused to sign for phantom losses at all, and he sent the post office letter after letter saying precisely why. In November 2003, the post office terminated his contract without giving a reason. Its own files disclosed years later called him unmanageable. He lost the shop and the £65,000. What the post office did not know was that it had just fired the one man in Britain who would never, ever let it go. Then the letters changed. Because the post office was not only these people's employer, their landlord of last resort, and the author of their contracts. In England and Wales, any company may bring a private prosecution, and the post office did on an industrial scale. When a shortfall appeared, the post office investigated the crime, and the post office decided the charge, and the post office prosecuted the case. Victim, detective, and prosecutor in one body. The police were not called because the police were not needed. Between 1999 and 2015, roughly 700 sub-postmasters were prosecuted by the post office itself, on average about one a week for a decade and a half. And keep one number running from here to the end of this film: the number of post office or Fujitsu employees convicted of anything for what you are about to watch. It never changes. The method was consistent enough that a court would later describe it in cold detail. Investigators would arrive, suspend the sub-postmaster on the spot, and interview them under caution, the post office's own staff playing detective in the shop the suspect owned. The charge sheet carried 2 counts: theft and false accounting. Theft was the hammer. It meant prison, headlines, ruin. And then quietly an offer: plead guilty to false accounting, pay back the shortfall, and the theft charge goes away. Joe Hamilton learned how the lever worked when the post office said her little shop in South Warnborough was £36,000 down. Its own investigators had reported in writing that there was no evidence of theft. She was charged with theft anyway, and offered the trade: plead guilty to 14 counts of false accounting, repay £36,644, and the theft count disappears. She took it the way almost everyone took it, because the alternative was a trial she could not afford to lose in front of people she had served for years. A criminal record for the crime of believing her employer's computer. The court's file preserves the post office's condition in its own words: a plea on the basis that the loss was due to the computer not working properly will not be accepted. In the case of Noel Thomas, a Welsh postman of 42 years' service who ran the counter at Gerwin on Anglesey, the record is even blunter. His guilty plea would be accepted only on the basis that he accepted that Horizon was working perfectly. You could have your freedom if you agreed the machine was innocent. Thomas went to prison for a £48,000 shortfall that never existed. He turned 60 inside. Around the same era, guidance issued to post office investigators was sorting the people they interviewed into racial categories, a document that would not surface for another 15 years. Not everyone could be pushed to a plea. Lee Castleton ran the post office in Bridlington on the Yorkshire coast. From January 2004, his screen conjured shortfall after shortfall, around £25,000, and he refused to accept the debt was real because he had counted his own till. So the post office took him to the High Court in a civil suit where there is no jury and the loser pays the winner's lawyers. Castleton had no money for barristers. He represented himself, a shopkeeper alone against an institution. He lost, and with the verdict came the bill for the post office's costs, £321,000. He was bankrupted over a phantom debt 1/13 that size. His wife began having seizures brought on by stress. His children were bullied at school. The family lost everything. The post office never collected most of the money. Collection was not the point. The point was what happened to the next sub-postmaster who thought about fighting. And then there is Seema Misra. She ran the post office at West Byfleet in Surrey. In January 2008, an audit found her branch £79,000 short on Horizon's ledger. She had put in her own money. She had told the helpline again and again that the system was generating losses she could not explain. She was charged with theft. The sum on the indictment, £74,609.84, calculated to the penny by a machine that could not do arithmetic. At Guildford Crown Court in October 2010, the post office's expert witness assured the jury the system was reliable. She was convicted. On the 11th of November 2010, her son's 10th birthday, Seema Misra was sent to prison for 15 months. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She served her time at Bronzefield, and when her second son was born the following summer, she was wearing an electronic tag. A pregnant woman went to prison on the word of a computer. That sentence should be impossible to write about modern Britain. Now here is the one that is worse. 11 weeks before her jury came back, the post office had already put in writing what would happen if anyone looked too closely at the machine. August 2010. An internal report lands on senior desks at the post office, written by the head of product and branch accounting. Its subject, how to respond to challenges to Horizon's integrity. Its logic, in the post office's own preserved words, is this: any independent investigation of the system would have to be disclosed in court, and any perception that POL doubts its own systems would mean that all criminal prosecutions would have to be stayed. It would also beg a question for the Court of Appeal over past prosecutions and imprisonments. There it is in one paragraph in 2010. Check the machine honestly, and every prosecution stops. Check the machine honestly, and the ones already in prison get to appeal. The institution had written down the price of the truth and decided prosecution by prosecution not to pay it. Seema Misra was convicted 11 weeks after that report. The expert who vouched for Horizon at her trial was a Fujitsu engineer named Gareth Jenkins, whose standard assurance was that the system will accurately record all data that is submitted to it and correctly account for it. The Court of Appeal would later record he had known of Horizon bugs since September of that same year and said nothing about them in his evidence. Because the bugs were real, and inside Fujitsu they had names. The calendar square bug, known about since the mid-2000s, which duplicated transactions. The receipts and payments mismatch bug of 2010, and internal note records discrepancies that vanish from the counter screen, but will still show within the back-end branch account, quietly corrupting the books of some 40 branches. Their existence was not folklore. It was ticketed, logged, and discussed on the vendor's side of a wall the sub-postmasters could not see. And on the far side of that wall sat something even the bugs could not match for secrecy. A support center in Bracknell, where Fujitsu engineers could reach into a branch's live accounts and change the numbers, without the sub-postmaster ever knowing anyone had been there. For years, the post office's public position was that this was flatly impossible. In 2012, under pressure from MPs led by James Arbuthnot, the post office appointed independent investigators, a small forensic accountancy firm, Second Sight, and for a moment it looked like daylight. Their first report, in July 2013, confirmed 2 live defects and a support system that failed the very people it existed to help. That same month, the post office's own barrister, Simon Clark, delivered a devastating legal advice. The expert evidence underpinning years of prosecutions was unreliable because the expert had known about the bugs. Weeks later, Clark recorded something darker. The post office had set up weekly calls to track Horizon's defects, and then someone gave an instruction about the minutes of those calls. The advice preserves it in one sentence. The emails and minutes should be and have been destroyed. The word shredded was conveyed to me. The thinking, as recorded, was simpler still. If it's not minuted, it's not disclosable. That summer, the summer its own lawyer used the word shredded, the post office was wearing down a man named Martin Griffiths. He had run the post office on Hope Farm Road in Ellesmere Port since 1995. From 2009, the shortfalls came, and the helpline told him what it told everyone. His family say he was made to feel he was the only one, while the same complaint poured in from across the country. He repaid and repaid. His elderly parents put in their life savings, about £62,000. In May 2013, his branch was robbed, and the post office's investigator held him partly responsible for the stolen money. In July 2013, it gave him notice of termination. On the 23rd of September 2013, Martin Griffiths deliberately walked in front of a moving bus. He died in hospital 18 days later. He was 59. The post office later reached a confidential settlement with his family. The public inquiry would eventually be told of at least 13 people who took their own lives in connection with this scandal, and of at least 59 more who contemplated it. Watch what the institution did next, because it is the tell. The prosecutions quietly stopped, from 42 in a single year to 2, then 0, with no announcement, no review of the convictions already won, no letter to the people already ruined. In March 2015, the post office sacked Second Sight and, as Arbuthnot told the House of Commons that week, told it to destroy all its papers. In January 2015, preparing to face a committee of MPs on the question of remote access, Chief Executive Paula Venables wrote in an email disclosed years later to the public inquiry, "I need to say no, it is not possible." A High Court judgment would later quote what the Chief Executive's office was asking behind closed doors that January. What is the true answer? I hope it is that we know this is not possible. Its formal answer to Parliament that same winter was absolute. There is no functionality in Horizon for either a branch, post office, or Fujitsu to edit, manipulate, or remove transaction data once it has been recorded in a branch's accounts. And when the BBC's Panorama put the question directly that summer, with a former Fujitsu engineer named Richard Roll saying on camera that engineers could and did reach into branch accounts, the post office denied it again. Every part of that sentence would die in a courtroom. It just needed someone with 20 years of patience to carry it there. The Army had been forming since 2009. In May of that year, a trade magazine, Computer Weekly, had published the first story anyone dared to print, by a young reporter named Rebecca Thompson. 7 sub-postmasters, 7 impossible shortfalls, 1 system. Alan Bates was one of the 7. That November, he hired a village hall in Fenny Compton, Warwickshire, picked more or less at random because it sat in the middle of England, and invited whoever else was out there. A couple of dozen strangers walked in. They had never met. Each of them had been told for years that they were the only one. They looked around a room full of only ones, and they gave themselves a name, the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. The press lane stayed narrow, but it never quite closed. In November 2010, a radio reporter named Nick Wallace took a call from a man whose pregnant wife had just been sent to prison over a till that would not balance. Seema Misra's husband, Devender. Wallace spent the next decade on the story when almost nobody else would touch it, on regional television, then in private eye, eventually in a book. The facts were available for years to anyone who looked. Almost nobody looked. What followed was not a montage, it was a grind that consumed the better part of 2 decades. Bates ran the campaign the way he had run his branch, from a kitchen table, on a laptop, with files. He wrote to ministers and was patted on the head. He gathered members in the dozens, then the hundreds. And in 2017, 555 sub-postmasters, bankrolled by litigation funders because none of them had money left, sued the post office in the High Court under a single group action. The lead name on the claim, alphabetically and in every other sense, Bates versus Post Office. The institution fought like an institution. It ran up costs designed to outlast the funders. In March 2019, when the first judgment savaged its sub-postmaster contracts, it did something almost unheard of. Mid-trial, it applied to remove the judge, Mr. Justice Fraser, from the case. The application failed within weeks, and the appeal court refused to touch it. And in December 2019, Fraser handed down the judgment the post office had spent 20 years making sure no one would ever write. The shoeboxes of receipts and the backed-up backups had finally met a judge who read every page. Legacy Horizon, he found, was not remotely robust. The post office's approach to the mounting evidence, he wrote, demonstrates a simple institutional obstinacy or refusal to consider any possible alternatives to their view of Horizon. This insistence on the system's integrity amounted to the 21st century equivalent of maintaining that the Earth is flat. And the denials about Bracknell collapsed entirely. Remote access to branch accounts, the court found, does exist. Such remote access is possible by employees within Fujitsu. It does exist specifically by design, and it has been used in the past. The post office's years of public assurances were, in the judge's words, specifically wrong, in fact. Before Christmas, Fraser referred his concerns about the evidence of Fujitsu's witnesses to the Director of Public Prosecutions. The 505 had won. Now look at what winning bought them. The post office had in fact already seen enough. Days before the judgment came down, it settled, £57.75 million. And after the litigation funders and the lawyers who had made the case possible took their share, the sub-postmasters were left with roughly $12 million between them. About £20,000 each for ruined businesses, bankruptcies, and prison. Alan Bates had beaten the post office in open court and could not even cover his members' losses. But the judgment was never really about the money. It was a key. Criminal convictions built on a machine now judicially certified as unreliable could finally be appealed, and the Criminal Cases Review Commission began referring them in batches. In December 2020, the first 6 convictions fell at Southwark Crown Court. And on the 23rd of April 2021 at the Royal Courts of Justice, the Court of Appeal ruled on 39 more and did not merely quash them. It found the post office had known. Paul knew that there were problems with Horizon. Paul knew that SPMs around the country had complained of inexplicable discrepancies. In short, Paul knew that there were serious issues about the reliability of Horizon. It had, the court said, effectively steamrolled over any SPM who sought to challenge its accuracy, and its failures were so egregious as to make the prosecution of any of the Horizon cases an affront to the conscience of the court. On the pavement outside stood Joe Hamilton, 18 years after a helpline talked her debt from £2,000 to £4. No longer in the eyes of the law, a thief. Cameras caught her half laughing, half crying, holding the paperwork. 39 names cleared. Then more in batches through 2022 and 2023, about 100 in all, which left roughly 900 convictions still standing, held by people now old or ill or dead, many of whom would not go near a courtroom again for anything. At the pace the system was managing, the last of them would die convicted. That is where this story stood on New Year's Eve 2023. What broke the logjam was not a judgment and not a report. It was a television schedule. On the 1st of January 2024, ITV began a 4-night drama called Mr. Bates vs. the Post Office. Actors playing Bates, Hamilton, Misra, the helpline calls, the shredded minutes, the whole quarter century. Nothing in it was new. Every fact had been in the public record for years, in judgments almost nobody outside the campaign had read. But close to 10 million people watched it in a week, 13.5 million by spring, and Britain went from not knowing the story to being unable to think about anything else. Within days, more than 1.2 million people signed a petition demanding Paula Venables lose her CBE, the honor she had been given in 2019 for services to the post office. On the 9th of January, she announced, "I return my CBE with immediate effect." On the 10th, the Prime Minister stood up in Parliament and promised something without precedent. The running number, employees of the post office or Fujitsu convicted for any of this, stood at 0 on the night the drama aired. It is worth watching closely through the reckoning that follows. On the 24th of May 2024, the Post Office Horizon System Offences Act received royal assent. Its first sentence does something no British law had ever done at this scale. Every conviction to which this act applies is quashed on the coming into force of this act. Not reviewed, not referred, quashed. Hundreds of convictions at the stroke of the King's pen, most of them without any court ever looking at the individual case again. In England and Wales alone, 619 people have so far been identified as cleared by the Act. Parliament had already, back in January, rushed through a first act to get money moving. The cleared were offered £600,000 each, full and final. or a longer, harder road if they believed their losses were bigger. The country's most senior former judges rose in the House of Lords to object, and their objection measures the failure. "Parliament does not quash convictions," said the former Lord Chief Justice. "That is a matter for the courts." He was right. That is exactly how bad it had become. The miscarriage was too big for the courts that caused it, and the Constitution had to be bent to clear the innocent in bulk. The calendar of that week is its own verdict. On the very Friday the act received the King's assent, across London, Paula Venables was completing 3 days of evidence to the public inquiry under a barrister's questions about the email that said, "I need to say no," about what she had been told and when. She wept repeatedly. "I was too trusting," she told the inquiry. 3 months earlier, the King had formally erased her honor. The notice in the official Gazette records that her CBE was cancelled and annulled. It remains to date one of the very few individual consequences anyone connected to this scandal has faced. In July 2025, the inquiry's chairman, Sir Win Williams, published the first volume of his final report, The Human Accounting. Roughly 1,000 people prosecuted and convicted on Horizon evidence. About 10,000 people now eligible for redress. At least 13 suicides linked to the scandal, a number he said may be higher. His word for the impact was disastrous, and his finding was that these people were victims of wholly unacceptable behavior by individuals and by the post office and Fujitsu as institutions. He attached 19 recommendations and a deadline for the institutions to answer him. By the summer of 2026, the government's ledger showed about £1.6 billion paid out to more than 12,900 claimants. Real money at last. Though Sir Alan Bates, knighted in 2024, was by then writing that the schemes had been turned into quasi-kangaroo courts, his own offer less than half of what he had lost. Fujitsu told Parliament in January 2024 it had a moral obligation to contribute. As of the middle of 2026, it had contributed nothing, and its engineers still run Horizon on a contract extended to 2027 because the machine at the center of all of this is still, today, on the counters of Britain's post offices. So finish the count. Roughly 1,000 people convicted on the word of a broken machine. About 700 of them prosecuted by their own employer, one a week for 15 years. By the BBC's count, 236 of them went to prison. At least 13 people are dead by their own hand. And the number of human beings convicted of any crime for doing this to them, after the shredded minutes, the buried advice, the denials a high court judge called specifically wrong, in fact, is still zero. A police investigation with more than 100 officers has 53 people under examination. It does not expect to put files before prosecutors until late 2027. The inquiry volumes that will name the culpable are, as of this summer, still unpublished. The detective leading the criminal case said it plainly this spring. Many victims are old now, some are already gone. We do not have the luxury of time. Somewhere in England tomorrow morning, a shutter will go up over a post office counter, and the screen behind it will still say Horizon. The system was told the truth about itself in 2010, in writing, and calculated that the truth was unaffordable. It spent the next decade buying time with other people's lives, and the bill so far has been paid by everyone except the people who wrote it. One more line of the ledger deserves its place. For years, a helpline told frightened people, one call at a time, that they were the only one. There turned out to be 10,000 of them. The sentence was a lie the first time it was spoken, and a lie every time after. And the cure for it, in the end, was not a court and not a law. It was a village hall in the middle of England, and a handful of ruined shopkeepers discovering that the only ones were an army. If you think a machine's word should never outweigh a human being's, and that someone eventually must answer for the ones it buried, hit like so the next story like this gets told before it takes 20 years.